Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to talk about the first year of marriage. So, the first year of marriage is often the hardest year, maybe not for all couples, but I think for some. And Mark and I are going to talk a little bit about our own experiences with the first year. I remember mine better than
Well,
Mark does because
mine's 46 years old. My first
exactly.
year. Yours isn't.
Yes.
Yours is 10, right? Or more?
11. Yeah.
11.
Mine's 11. Mine's only 11 years old, so I remember it better. But we'll talk a little bit about it. So, and the reason why it's often hard for most couples is the way Mark has always described it is you are basically taking too many cultures and you're combining them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you have people who grew up very, very differently. And, even in America, I mean, you think about the differences of family dynamics, and it's one of those things where when you grow up, that's all you know. You don't know anything's different until you spend any amount of time with another family. And then
Right.
I don't think you really realize just exactly how different it is until you're intimately involved with someone and you're like, oh, they really do things differently than we do.
What I've run into in the office with couples, how you celebrate holidays, for instance. You
Yep.
can think of that as a cultural, I mean, even in, throughout the world, cultures celebrate them differently. But even say in our country, you're going to have, your family growing up probably celebrated Christmas in a very different way than mine. And
Hmm.
and so it's taking these two different worlds and then trying to combine them. Well, you said it may not be hard for everyone, which is probably true, but I think it's hard for vast majority of couples because of the changes. I
Hmm.
mean, and then I was thinking about for most people who get married, not all, but for most, there's this intense passion,
Yes.
right? That kind of overrides everything. And I always have this vision of Disney movies with the birds coming and, tweeting
Hmm.
around because everything's wonderful. I guess, what is it, Snow White and Prince Charming or something?
Yep.
That's the vision of, when you're in love. Well, so you decide to get married or you move in together and you have this passion, these great feelings, you're in love, and the feeling is that, gosh, this is going to be perfect, right? And
Yep.
I actually run into this with couples a lot because they think we're in love and then they get married and they expect it to be the same. And then, the first time that they have that conflict and, a little bit of a bump in the road, it really throws them off. And they sometimes think, oh, I'm not in love anymore, or
Yeah.
it's fading fast. But I've said this before often on the podcast, I think, is that I think it takes 5 to 10 years to learn how to be married.
Yes.
And so couples who get married, I think you should expect that.
Yeah.
I was thinking about some of the things that, say, affected my first year with Lindy. And for instance, loss of independence. And I don't know that it's lost, maybe loss of independence isn't the best way to phrase it because we choose, I think when you get married, you choose to give up some of that independence.
Yeah.
It's a choice. And I think people have known that. Now, from my experience with couples, often I think the men have a harder time with that, uh,
Hmm.
giving up that independence, but it can still be difficult for women as well. I think once you live together, you're there all the time and you see all the flaws. The flaws start to come out
Yes.
didn't experience when you were dating because everything was wonderful. And then you start to have conflicts. And so you have the conflicts, and we've mentioned the big three: money, sex and romance, extended family.
Yep.
You start to have those conflicts in different ways than you might have, or maybe you didn't even have the conflict in dating. So the thing that I think is most important for couples, like if you're in your first year or you are contemplating getting married, I think you need to learn it's the communication. You
Hmm.
need to learn how to resolve conflicts and talk about the issues. You've got to have a good dialogue. What was your first? Do you remember your first year?
Yeah, I do. So ours, I think, was a little bit unique in that I had some hormonal problems going on my first year. So I started birth control for the first time a couple of months before we got married, right?
Uh-huh.
And then I switched pills 4 times in 6 months. Nobody told me that that's a really bad idea.
But that's really hard on your system. Oh
Oh,
my,
yeah.
I bet it's like your body's going, what the hell? What's going on?
No, that's, but you're right, right? I mean, pardon your French, but you have it exactly right. That's exactly what happened. And I was an emotional basket case. I was a crazy person. And Curtis had to have been wondering, what in the heck did
What
I
did
get
he
myself
do?
right? Right? I mean, and I tell you what, though, I look back and I'm like, man, you talk about dedication. And we've talked about this before. And I asked him, I was like, I mean, did you feel that way? Did you wonder? Like, did you think that? And he's like, I was worried that I wasn't going to be able to keep you. I was worried that you were going to leave me. And I'm
Mm.
like, you're a saint.
We talked a long time ago about commitment. It's all about
Yeah.
commitment, and he was committed to you. Well, you were committed to each other.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, and that's really what it comes down to is he was determined to stick it out. He was very, very committed to our marriage. He was very committed to me. And so, he was going to do everything he possibly could to make it work. But I mean, I was difficult to deal with, and I will own that. Like, I mean, and he handled it very well. He was very exemplary through all of it. And so after that, I feel like we adjusted pretty well. I mean, and I want to say we've just always had good communication. I think that's just always been a strength for us. And so we've always, or at least we learned very early on how to talk about things. And so one of the things that I've always thought is crucial for couples to do in the first few years, but especially in that first year, is to learn how to talk about the little things, both the
Mhm.
good things and the bad things. I mean, especially I would say the good things are more important to talk about because, your spouse may be doing something for you and you really appreciate it. They may not know that what they're doing is appreciated, right? I
Mhm.
mean, they may not realize what it means to you. And so it's so important to say, hey, I appreciate when you do this. I appreciate that you do this for me or that you do this way so they can know. I think that's important to talk about as much as we wish. And I may be stereotyping here, I may be making a generalization, but it was definitely me. I wanted so desperately for Curtis to be a mind reader. I
Mhm.
wanted him more than anything else to be able to know me well enough to know what I was thinking, right?
Right.
Which
Which never
you're
happens.
no, no. No, it's not real life. Anyway, so it's important to talk about those things. And then the other thing that can be harder but is still important is to talk about the bad things, like the little things that are obnoxious. And they're going to happen. Just prepare yourself. Your spouse is going to do something that is going to annoy you or that's going to bug you. And so it's important to learn how to talk about that. And so there's a few things that I've come up with, or at least this is what has worked really well for Curtis and I. I ask him, and it's so important not to be aggressive with this, right? So you need to be assertive, but you need to not be aggressive. So, I mean, a really common example is, the way you put the toilet paper roll on. Okay.
Oh,
Right.
no. Wait, was that an issue?
I mean, not really because he didn't care and I did.
Okay.
So
Okay. Okay.
or I mean, okay, another one could be where the way you squeeze the toothpaste. I know.
Okay. The solution for that is you each have your own toothpaste.
Why did it take me so many years to figure
I
this
figured
out?
that.
Okay, so, but I mean, let's say you're trying to, well, I guess it doesn't matter how frugal you are because if you each have your own separate tube of toothpaste, it's just twice as long until you have to buy more toothpaste. But
That's
anyways,
right.
I mean, it could be a little thing. I'll give another really good example. So when Curtis and I got married, his mindset was if you dirty a dish and you're going to put it in the sink, you need to rinse it first. You need to
Okay.
rinse, and we didn't have a dishwasher, so we had to do all our dishes by hand. And he wanted the dishes rinsed, and I was in the habit of just putting my bowl in the sink, like
Okay.
and this
Hmm.
bothered him. And so he said, "Hey, can you rinse your dish when you put it in the sink, please?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, sure." And it's so easy for that to go the other way because, I mean, maybe people think that's just normal. Like if that's the way you grow up, why wouldn't you do that, right? In someone's mind, that's kind of how it can be. And so it would be really easy for Curtis just to let that fester and let it bubble and boil until it erupts. And then
Yeah.
all of a sudden we're having this big, huge fight over it. And I have no idea why he's blowing up at me over this. Whereas he came at it and he said, can we do it this way instead?
Yeah.
And if you present it that way, it's going to go much better.
As you're talking, the words that come to mind is I think it's about skill acquisition.
Okay.
And so we're working on skills as a newly married couple, we're working on skills that we really didn't have to have,
Yeah.
being single, being on our own, or even dating, because
Hmm.
it's different. Because so the bowl in the sink is a really good example because when you're dating, it's not going to be an issue,
Yep.
or it's only going to be an issue once you start living together. But you aren't going to go over to each other's home and say, "Why are you putting the bowl in the sink and not rinsing it?" No
Yeah.
one would say that.
Yeah.
But then once you live together, it becomes an issue. So there are things that you might have wondered about, but weren't an issue until you actually came together
Hmm.
and started living together. So I think it's mostly that, is that you're with each other morning, night, and on the weekends. And so it's skill acquisition about dialogue. So for Curtis that's a little bit unusual from my experience, for
Hmm.
learning to be able to say, early on, hey, can we do something different, is really healthy because I see it where people hold it in. Sometimes they hold it in for years, and then five
Yeah.
years down the road, they're talking about what happened 5 years ago, and it's really hard to make sense of it and get back to 5 years ago, and you've been storing up all this anger. So I agree. It's having the dialogue, communicating, talking about the good things, the hard things, the big things, the small things.
Yep.
And that's why I think for a lot of people, not everyone, but for a lot of people, they can benefit from doing some sort of premarital work.
Yes.
Because if you wait till the first year, if you think that everything's going to run smoothly, I don't know that it does ever.
No. No.
And so I think if you prepare and say, okay, we're going to run into some bumps. We love each other very much. It's going to be a little bit bumpy. Let's prepare for it.
Hmm.
I think that's the wisest thing to do. Now, I tell this to young couples because occasionally I will do premarital counseling,
Hmm.
and it really works so much better because they're anticipating, they're learning that, and so what they're doing is preparing, and I think it's really important. That book, Robin Smith, Lies at the Altar.
Yeah.
We've mentioned it during several different episodes. I still think that's a really good thing for couples premaritally to look
Hmm.
at because it will bring up issues and it will spark conversations about things that you may not have ever thought of,
Oh, yeah.
but you need to. And so I think that's the value in it, is there's no way you can anticipate everything.
Hmm.
And so with those 276 questions, so pretty good job of anticipating some of those problems.
Right. And so this year I went back to school and I'm getting my degree online, and I'm getting a degree in marriage and family studies. And so one of the classes that I'm taking this semester is a marriage skills class. And this last week or the week before, we talked about consumer marriages and how people
I haven't
often,
heard that term. What does that mean?
so people treat their marriages like they do as a consumer of products and goods. I really, it seemed to boil down to their level of commitment, right? They're treating their marriage as something that is dispensable or replaceable.
Oh, yeah, that speaks to lack of commitment, I think.
I agree. And so one of the things that they talked about, and because they asked us to reflect on what aspects of consumer marriage that you may have gotten caught up in, and one of the ones that I definitely did was happily ever after,
Uh-huh.
which is a big fat lie. There's
Well, I don't know. It's a big fat lie. I think it's just bumpy getting there.
I don't know. Okay, so my
Well, how
opinion,
did how do you define happily ever after? What does that mean to you?
it never happens because true love never ends. So, I mean, to me, so like, I don't believe in happily ever after because I mean, there's no end to mine and Curtis's story. And part of it is I'm religious. And so I believe that we'll be together after this life.
I'm
Curtis,
confused. Are you thinking that happily ever after means that there's some sort of end to it?
well, and they lived happily ever after. Nobody just lives happily ever after. There's always more to the story. Something else is
Well,
going to happen. I
that,
guess,
yeah. I mean, the way we're just interpreting it in a different way. I
yeah.
think so. You've been married 11 years. I've been married 46 years.
Hmm.
And, you get to this point where Lindy and I are at, and we've seen a lot of the problems and worked through them. It's not that there haven't been, but maybe we've exhausted the supply, most of the supply of problems.
Yeah.
So, at this stage, for a lot of couples, it becomes easier.
Okay. Yeah.
And, if you haven't figured out how to talk about the issues now, you still can, but it's
Yeah.
a little late. But so it's not that issues don't come up, but we have a much more effective way of talking about them and really interacting. And I think that's something that evolves all the time. So I think happily ever after to me means that you're staying together through the end of life or whatever that means to people. And I realize
Hmm.
that means something different to you than it does to me.
Hmm.
So from my standpoint, being an atheist, I think it does end.
Right.
And so for me, happily ever after is to the end of our time together.
Right. And I appreciate your perspective, and I think I agree. I can see that. So you and Lindy were in your early 20s when you got married. So that
Yeah.
means that you've been married for twice as long as you were single. So you
Yes.
guys,
Well,
like,
and
more
adolescent
than.
kid. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so you guys have spent 2/3 of your lives
Yes.
together.
Yeah.
And so, that's not insignificant. So, yeah, I mean, if you're still together after all that time, I would imagine that things have got to be easier. I can see that feeling like happily ever after.
I've never used that term to describe my marriage, but I would say it fits.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that I would use that, but because it's kind of that Disney-esque fairy
Yeah.
tale. But,
See, and I mean, to a large extent, I feel like Curtis, well, I don't know. I mean, maybe Curtis and I are halfway there. I don't know. I mean, so, if there is one thing in my life that I can point to and say, this is working really, really well, it's my marriage. And it's not, yeah, and it's not because my marriage is perfect. And it's not because, Curtis and I never have conflict and, we never have disagreements and we never have times where we don't like each other. But it's because, I mean, after 11 years, I'm still stupid in love with him and he's still my favorite person in the entire world. And we still want to spend all our time together. We're kind of that mushy, obnoxious couple that people sometimes maybe don't like.
but see, you've gone, so I say 5 to 10 years, you're at 11. You've
Yep.
got tremendous skill acquisition
Oh
in
yeah.
those 10, 11 years,
Hmm.
right?
Oh
And
yeah.
in the first year of marriage, couples typically don't have children. It's usually further on. You're 11 years on, and so you have these children. That's a whole different level of skill acquisition to how to be parents together. But
Hmm.
typically, I think most often the issue of children is not the issue in the first year of marriage. It might be
Right.
soon after that, but it's just timing wise, being pregnant for 9 months,
Hmm.
it's going to fall somewhere in the second, third, fourth, or fifth, or beyond.
And our oldest was born 3 weeks after our first anniversary. So
Okay.
I
Well, but right, it was still after your first year, so you had all that.
Yeah, yeah. So we had that whole first year. And it's hard for me to really compare because I mean, our first year, I feel like our challenges were a little bit unique in
Hmm.
that, I mean, I had some hormonal issues that kind of really, messed things up. But I think I still learned a lot. And I would say that the reason why Curtis and I have always had such good skills is because we've always been so strong in communication. And I
Hmm.
think a big part of that is we're both pretty easygoing, but both of us are really good at not getting defensive.
Yeah,
And that's a very important skill to
it's
learn is
critical.
yeah. And so going back to that conversation I had about, rinsing your dishes, it might not have gone, I don't think it went exactly like that. I mean, I wanted to give a really good example. That was like a perfect example. Curtis might have said, "Can you please rinse your dishes before you put them in the sink?" And he was probably a little annoyed. But I said,
Uh-huh.
"Oh, yeah, okay." So, and, that may be a little more typical of how conversations go for couples. But I mean, again, he wasn't come flat out attacking me. He wanted me to do it different. He maybe didn't do it the best way, but in turn, I didn't get defensive about it. I didn't get
No.
argumentative about it. I recognized, okay, he wants something done a certain way. I don't mind doing it. So, yeah, sure, we'll do it that way.
See,
And it's worked.
see, I think it's one of those skills that hopefully we all acquire is learning how to be soft.
Yeah.
So I think I've used the terms, Gottman uses this term, harsh versus soft.
Hmm.
And the harshness is, it can be the tone of voice, it can be the words we use. And so it's really different to say, I can't believe you put your dishes in the sink dirty. Can you just rinse them? That's a little harsh, right?
Yes. Yes.
You can say, you can even be introspective and say, when I grew up, I was used to rinsing the dishes, putting them in the sink. Would you be able to do that? So it's the process. That's what I call process.
Yep.
And so you can be soft or you can be harsh. I think it's a skill that hopefully we all acquire early on is how do you be soft?
Yes. And it changes the whole tone and the whole
Oh yeah.
mood of the conversation. Because
Right.
if you go at it harshly, then your partner is immediately going to be put on the defensive. Whereas if you go at it softly, then they're going to be much more receptive to it. It's just human nature and it's going to work vice versa. I'm telling you, just try it. If you want to do something different, just go to your partner and say, could we do it this way instead?
What you reminded me of is if it comes across harsh, often it feels like an accusation. And
Yes.
then often we internalize that, oh, I've just done something really bad. When really what you're doing is you're just doing what you grew up with, putting
Hmm.
the dish in the sink, which, I mean, if you had two people who did that, it doesn't matter. I mean, you're both doing the same thing, right? So it's not right or wrong.
Yep.
It's not an attack, but if you feel like there's this harsh response, it's like, oh man, I've done something wrong. So there's something wrong with me because I've got this dirty dish that I put in the sink when it's not that at all. It's preference. And I
Yes.
think a lot of the issues that we run into in the first year, it'd be interesting to, if someone's ever done some sort of survey, I would guess it's a lot of preference because you're living together and, how do you prefer to do things? Dishes in the dishwasher. Oh my
Yep.
gosh. I think I've said this before. I once spent a whole session, and I can't remember how long this couple had been married. We spent maybe not a whole session, how the towels go in the towel cupboard. Do they
Yeah.
go do they go lengthwise or I make it felt crazy to me.
Yeah.
I
Well,
didn't say that.
right,
I
right.
just, okay, if this is where you need to go.
From an outsider perspective, that feels inconsequential, but
Hmm.
clearly in their marriage, it was a big deal,
Well, to
right?
one of them,
Yes,
it was a big deal.
yes.
Um,
I have
and
a feeling though, Mark, it wasn't about the towel.
I can't, it's been so long. I
Yeah,
think you're probably right.
yeah,
This is a long time ago, but
yeah.
you're probably right. I can't remember what it came down to.
But
I mean,
I,
often it's about control, wanting to, and so you get into that first year of marriage. I think it goes back to maybe loss of independence because when I was living alone, I got to put the towels in the cupboard any way I wanted,
yep,
and now I can't. And so, it's loss of independence and control. But
yeah,
most of the issues, I mean, here's another thing. Most of the issues with couples, and this isn't just in the first year, often have to, maybe I'll say often, has to do with power and control.
yeah. And that makes a lot of sense because again, you're used to doing things one way. I mean,
Yeah.
for how many years before you got married? For a lot of people, 20 to 30 years. That's a long way to do something a certain way.
Right. And I think culturally people are waiting longer, at least
Yep.
to get married. And so they're, late 20s, early 30s. And so they've been single,
Yeah.
you know, 10 years at least. That's a long
Hmm.
time,
And that
right?
was maybe, yeah, and that was maybe a benefit to me and Curtis. I think that worked out well for us. He's 5 years older than me, and I was young when we got married. I was 19, and he had been single and living on his own. I mean, he moved out on his 18th birthday.
Hmm.
So he had 6 years of living independently and doing things the way he was used to. And I think overall he adjusted to it really well to including me, but it was a little bit of a process to him. And I had to kind of remind him that a little bit sometimes. And I feel like he overall did, remarkably well with that. I mean, because at 19, I don't know, I didn't have a lot of my own specific way of doing things. And so it was pretty easy for us to kind of meld, I guess, our cultures together as
Yeah.
you as you
Well,
went
you had
along.
you had a lot of common themes that brought you together too.
That too.
One of the things that I try and help young couples understand, what I try and tell them is single people act and behave differently than married people do.
Yes.
And a lot of people have trouble making that transition. Now, I'll make a generalized statement, which I often do. Often it's men who have that trouble more than women. And that's just from my experience from the couples that I've seen. And so single men act and behave differently than married men. And you've got to be able to make that transition. And if you get married and you want to behave and act as a single person, that is not going to work.
No.
And so one of the ways to, like if you, for some people, they might go out to the bars with their buddies. I think it's important that you have that time, that you have individual time as well as couple time, but you don't do it to the same frequency that you may have. And
Yeah.
you do it without some sort of consideration to your spouse.
Yes.
And so that's what needs to change. And often it's like, well, I get to go out with my friends whenever I want. Not really,
Yeah.
because you have chosen, when you marry, I think you choose to give up some of that independence because you are now committed to someone else.
And if that idea sounds absolutely terrible to you, then I don't think you're ready to get married.
You're not ready,
Yeah.
right? Because I think that's implicit in marriage.
Yeah.
Is that we become committed and not dependent isn't the right word, but we are responsible to someone else,
Yeah. I think
and
dependent,
we have to take them into account.
yeah, I think dependent is a good way
Maybe
to
that's
just,
it. Yeah.
yeah, I
Okay.
would describe it as dependent. I mean, and not that you're completely dependent, but I mean, I think there should be dependency. There's certainly expectations,
Hmm.
and it is not, and I'm telling you now, it is not too much to expect from your spouse to know, at least in general, where they are and what's going on with their lives. Like if you're going to be late from work, hey, I'm
Right.
running late. I'm just letting you know. That's not controlling, right? Or hey, I've got my buddies want to go do this weekend. Some people think, wow, what did your wife run your schedule to? And it's like, no, I want to make sure that she doesn't have anything else planned. I'm going to check with my wife, make sure I'm free, and then yeah, I'd love
Yeah.
to go out and hang out with you guys.
Right. And so it's being able to make that transition, which is hard
Yeah.
for some people. And so I agree. Most often it's not about control. Sometimes it is.
Yeah.
But most often those issues aren't about control. It's just, we are married. I would like to know when you're going to come home because that's helpful. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's all it is. So I
Yeah.
think that some of the things I was thinking about that's important to, expectations. That's the
Yes.
word you brought
Hmm.
up. That's one of those things. Couples, you should be talking about what your expectations are before you get married.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and again, referring back to Robin Smith's book, Lies at the Altar, I think that's what those questions help us do,
Hmm.
because it brings up, well, my expectation is we celebrate Christmas this way. Well, my expectation is that we don't. So you get those expectations out on the table. Earlier is much better than later.
Yes.
And I think doing a lot of this before you're married is really important. One of the things we've talked about before in one of our episodes, this might be under the category of skill acquisition.
Hmm.
Always be on the side of your spouse,
Yes.
not on the camp of your friends and family.
Hmm.
That can be something that you have to learn and that you have
Hmm.
to get used to. I think that's really important. Look for the positives, turn away from the negatives. I think it's okay to have individual interests, but you've got to really work on the couple interests, and you have to focus on the we. You still have the I's,
Hmm.
the two I's that come together to form the we, but you have to pay attention to the we.
Yeah.
So, and then the other thing I think is important is self-care. A lot
Yes.
of couples, they don't think about that. Self-care, exercise. Again, I'm not making a moral judgment on alcohol or cannabis use, but I think you have to moderate alcohol and cannabis use in order to be fully present in the relationship. And I have seen many times throughout my career, a couple come in and they'll say to me, the only time we fight is when we've had too much to drink.
Mm.
Now, I don't have that duh moment, but I say, okay, if you don't want to fight, then you need to change the way you drink alcohol.
Yeah.
It's kind of a no-brainer. And so I think that as a single person, that may not have been as big of an issue or an issue at all. When you get married, and then especially when you have kids, then it becomes a big issue.
Yes.
So you need to discuss those things before or in the early stages of the marriage.
I think another important thing too is not brushing things off. So I still remember mine and Curtis's very first disagreement as a couple. We were engaged and we were talking about the birth of children and how that would go. And I said, I'm never having a baby in a hospital. And Curtis says, we're never having a baby anywhere but a hospital. And in that moment, because that was so far distant, it was so
Yeah.
easy and so tempting to just push it off to the side and say, we'll cross that bridge when it comes. Don't do that.
Now I want to know where you had your children.
In a
At
hospital
home?
with a midwife.
Okay. A
That was our
compromise.
yes,
Somewhat of
that
a compromise. Okay.
yes, that was our compromise. But don't brush those things off, right?
No.
I mean, don't just sweep it under the rug and save it for a later because it's going to come back up.
Right. But see, at least, you talked about it early on. Well, even before you were married, I think is what you said.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so what happens is you get married and it's still in the back of your mind, oh, we need to figure this out because this is going to be an issue. So it doesn't come as a complete surprise
That's
that
true.
you're on your way to your 9 months and you say, we're doing this at home. No, we're doing this at the hospital. That's kind of last minute preparation.
A little bit.
But I think that bringing it up, even though the issue might be far away,
Yes.
I think it can still be helpful because it's in your consciousness now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So there was just a few things that I think that in conclusion that I wanted to bring up around expectations. So I think, and these were a few of the big ones that I felt like are typically an issue. That's household chores, right? So who's going to do what? Finances. I think that's important to talk about. Establishing a budget early on can be a huge step ahead in your marriage. And the other thing that I don't think couples talk about enough, particularly in religious settings, is sex. You need to talk about sex, and more often, and most importantly, expectations around it. Frequency, timing. Do we both reach climax every time? Or is it okay if just he does and, I don't? Those are conversations that you need to be having.
Right. And some of those conversations can occur early on as the issues come up. Because I think in sexuality, especially, in a religious setting, if you haven't been sexually active, then you aren't going to know a lot of these things.
Yes.
Until it actually starts happening. But it goes back to the thing that both you and I agree on. The most important thing is dialogue and being able to communicate. That's it. Because you are going to have bumps. There are going to be issues. And one thing on your outline I want to bring up, disagreeing a lot doesn't mean you aren't compatible, and it doesn't mean you don't love each other.
Yes.
I run into that often. It's normal. You aren't the same person. You don't marry yourself. You actually marry someone else.
Yeah.
There will be disagreements and there will be conflict. It's all in how you approach it.
I remember when Curtis and I first got married, we disagreed on like 90% of everything. And it wasn't conflict outside of my, hormonal issues going on. I feel like we had relatively little conflict, but we had to learn to compromise and we had to come to an agreement on almost everything. And now it's probably closer to like 30% that we disagree or something like that. I don't know. But it takes time. It's okay. You're going to disagree. There is going to be conflict.
Right. But I think what, in listening to you through these episodes, you acquired skills.
Yes.
That, that you may not have had going into it. I mean, you certainly had some skills, but I would guess 11 years on, you're pretty skillful at this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I felt like we've always had a good marriage, but it's even better than it was 11 years ago.
That's my happily ever after, Liz.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, it's better. It keeps getting better.
It keeps getting better.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So next week, we are going to talk about family crisis and how to handle that when it comes up, and in particular, stressor events, because, I mean, especially if you have kids, I promise you there are going to be stresses
guaranteed.
Yes, in a family. It's inevitable.
Yep.
All right. So we will see y'all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.